Hello people of the internet, it's Samantha, and if you're new here on my channel, I usually talk about Japanese movies, dramas, entertainment. Sometimes I tap into other Asian pop culture topics as well, and as you've seen from the title of the video below, today we're going to be talking about Marry My Husband Japan's episodes 5 to 8. Now, I've talked about episodes 1 to 4 in a previous video, shared kind of like my first impression review of the series so far. I've seen the K-drama version. I haven't read the webtoon that it was based off of. So this is mostly gonna be partially, comparative in terms of the K-drama and the J-drama. I know that it's been mentioned over and over that they aren't meant to be like adaptations of each other, but considering that they share the same source material, I think it's just fair to kind of like talk through some thoughts about these two versions, but at the same time putting more focus on my thoughts as to how the episodes are so far in terms of plot, everything, etc. So with that said, let's just get to it. I initially wanted to make a video for episodes 5 and 6, especially considering how brilliant the elements are for those two episodes. The way that everything was kind of like weaved together, the way that it ended on episode 6, and that kind of like high that those two episodes delivered. But I figured I wanted to kind of like divide us in a way that I'm talking about like the first 4 episodes and then the next 4 episodes after that, and then we move on to the finale. And I wanted to get like a bigger picture as to how the story would progress based off of what happened in those 2 episodes, and where that would leave us in terms of building up the conclusion for the series. Now that said, a lot of pivotal things happened in episodes 5 and 6. First one is that Misa learns of her connection with Wataru from when they were students. We also find out that Wataru has met Misa's father prior to that, and he kind of like earned his approval even before like all these other things. And that's probably part of the reason why when Misa's angel father came to her in her previous life, she redirected her to Wataru, not necessarily for romantic reasons, but mostly due to just a general connection of it all. And obviously it's always been implied that Wataru was in love with Misa, but I think through in this story, it wasn't more so that he was purely pursuing her for romantic reasons. He just genuinely wanted her to live a really good life. And I think that's also weaved in the way that they're kind of like portraying the story. Is they kind of like developed a friendship earlier on, and they also kind of like resonated off of each other, not just as romantic prospects, but just generally as people. And the way that even in his initial life, Wataru didn't really like pursue her in a sense, or there wasn't really kind of like a romantic connection in their prior life that would kind of like I think the important thing was like they've built a connection in their second life that gives it enough merit for it to actually be love, as compared to like the first one where it's kind of like more of a distant crush from Wataru's end, and someone that he probably found really interesting and fascinating and just and just really kind and all that. So yeah, it really kind of like solidifies or fortifies their relationship a little bit better in their second life, the way that it's kind of like laid out there. And I think the only reason why he ended up kind of like pursuing her further is like he genuinely properly fell in love with her the second time around, and that if she chooses not to be with him, then he seems pretty fine with it. He seems very hesitant about actively pursuing her in a sense as well. It was really like the way that they played it out is it's still ultimately her choice, and all he wanted to do was to make sure that she kind of like lives her life the second time around. So there. Another thing is that in terms of, I think they handled the event, the food showcase event a lot more tastefully, because in the Korean version, obviously, like the two characters, the best friend and the husband or the future husband, was already having an affair at the time, and it was because they were like, messing around, and that's the reason why there was this entire mess in the first place. But for this one, I think they handled it in a sense that was more kind of like how it goes. It really was consistent in terms of Reina's personality to just be kind of like reckless about the entire thing, considering how we see her since the beginning and how she treats her job and how she kind of like slides off of things, because she knows how to kind of like work her way around, their manager and just everything about it. Basically, generally it was handled in a sense that was a lot more, I mean, the Korean version was definitely a lot more satisfying in terms of like people getting what they deserve. But for this one, again, it plays into kind of like the realistic undertone of, how things like this would usually be handled. Obviously, there's still like the theatrics of it, of Misa kind of like playing it off and calling out Tomoya in front of the office so that everybody knows and all that. But again, it was handled a little bit more tastefully in a sense. It's not as thrilling and as satisfying as the Korean version, but that one is just way too unprofessional to happen in the workplace. And I know like we're watching these things not because of the realism, but because of, the fun it provides. But there's just something about, workplace stuff that you can only just go so far in terms of portraying what you can and can't do. Um, and I think the Japanese version definitely handled it a lot more with care, I guess. Um, and I think the ending of episode 6 was really nicely done. I've always loved how this drama knows how to circle back into its own moments. So I've talked about it in my previous video with the umbrella, with the orange, with the turtle, and now with the stage. So Misa once talked about, wanting to join the drama club, but because of Reina's intervention, like she wasn't able to do so. But here, even if it's just metaphoric, she was able to set the stage and kind of like act out this role of being devastated while knowing for a fact that her wanted outcome was already happening when it comes to Tomoya and Reina. And I really, really love that. Now, in terms of episode 7 and 8, so the kind of like the result of all those other things have already happened. So Tomoya and Reina finally get married. Reina pretended to be pregnant so that she can and like steal Tomoya away from Misa. And she was laid off of her job. She was still kind of like playing it off in a sense that, she was still she was still thinking that she still has Misa um, at the palm of her hands. I think the most interesting thing about this version, at least, two things for me, that is outside of, Misa. Two things. Reina's backstory. I like that it didn't play it off as they have this kind of like, even when they were young, she has this like vengeful agenda, as compared to like the Korean version. I like that Reina has her own kind of like story, and that isn't to say that everyone who has a similar background ends up like her, but it was the way that she coped with these things and how things have ended. And they didn't really kind of like dig deep into when she kind of like started to resent Misa in a sense, or when she started off like doing what she did to Misa. But it was pretty clear, at least for me, the way that they portrayed the story, that Reina was quite miserable given everything that has happened to her and her family. And she finds someone else that was kind of like also going through the same thing, just on a different level. And the fact that she was able to be there for that particular person, it has twisted her in a sense that initially it seems to me like they started off as a genuine friendship. But as it went on, it became very kind of like codependent, hyper dependent, in a sense that she was clinging on to Misa and doing everything in her power to not to ensure that like she wouldn't get abandoned. Um, and I think I like that in a sense that it didn't antagonize her as a kid. Um, and I like that their friendship was kind of like based off of circumstance rather than her plotting everything since she was young. I think it also adds more depth to just the relationship in general, because it kind of like shows that um again, it hits a lot harder because it started off as like these two kids sharing the same thing, and then it ended up being, you know, how it is when you kind of like cling on to something that is, and again, there's just a lot more kind of like there's just a lot more depth in the way that or Reina kind of like spirals all throughout the stories, because I don't know, like I think in the Korean version, because she has reason to kind of like resent Misa, it's kind of like two people adapting to a very similar situation in two different ways, really positioning Misa in this kind of like really kind, understanding position. Whereas for the Japanese version, it kind of like just leaves these two people who found each other, but unfortunately, because of like certain factors, certain things, it ended up the way that it did. It kind of shows more about Reina's character as well. Um, and I like that. I believe that here in the Japanese version, considering the limited number of episodes, they wouldn't go into kind of like the convoluted way of Reina kind of like paying off Misa's mother. I don't know. Maybe they would still go that route, but it kind of like doesn't make sense for the plot to go into that too late into the story. Um, but yeah, I think like Reina's backstory for this particular version definitely gives a different tone to their relationship and how things turn out the way that they did. And I really, really like that. And then the other thing that I want to talk about would be Tomoya. I've tweeted about this. What's interesting about this version as compared to the Korean version when it comes to the boyfriend and eventually husband role is Tomoya isn't exactly evil, I would say. Like in the Korean version, I feel like again they really played it off with the extremes. You know, yes, and he was kind of like he also was still very much interested in his other like in the Misa character, the female lead character, but you know, he was really enjoying that affair a lot and all these things. But then for this one, like yes, um Tomoya kind of like had didn't just do it with Reina once. But I think I'm not sure if it's just the portrayal of Yokoyama Yu or just the writing in general of the character. But it feels like he it feels a lot more, I don't know, kind of like genuine in a sense that when he said he actually did love Misa or still loves Misa. And I know that you don't, you know, like you don't excuse some loving someone and then cheating on them. But there are some people in real life who do believe that they love this person but they cheated because of blah 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 reasons, whatever. I mean, I feel like that's the thing with this Tomoya is that he's not exactly an evil person. He's just very man. Like he's such a bare minimum baddie, um and he has, he has this level of narcissism in him, and he also kind of like he has his moments, but at the same time, again, it's mostly like he's thinking that he's good enough because he's doing the bare minimum. And I think the reason why this is so vile is because he's definitely so real for that. In the Korean version, I think it's easy to kind of like say that the guy was just downright douche, something like that. But in the Japanese version, I think this kind of like pricks a little bit more, because again, the way that they shaped his character and the way Yokoyama Yu portrayed the character as well, it's just way too realistic in a sense. Like, he's not evil, but it's just like it's something that you encounter every single day. And probably like a lot of women watching this series or just in real life have been with a person like this, or have know someone who's exactly like the Tomoya in the series. And what I mean by that is, I think the distinction for this drama is that scene where Misa was talking to Wataru about why she felt secure with Tomoya. And this was one instance where Reina, they were just starting out dating, and Reina was kind of like making a move on Tomoya, asking for his number. And even when Misa was away, Misa heard Tomoya say that he didn't want Misa to misunderstand, so he wouldn't give his number to Reina. And that that made Misa feel that she could trust him. And in that particular moment, it really made me think that the reason why Tomoya is vile as it is because women experience this so realistically that at the slightest, like sometimes at the slightest kindness, because of how low the bar is, because of like those little moments, it's so easy to fall and settle into the bare minimum and only realize later on just how much you're settling for and how much you're kind of like lowering or kind of like basing off of your standard for something that someone should do at the barest minimum. And that wasn't even that special. I mean, he he was the one who initially liked her, and therefore it is his responsibility to commit to her the way that he did. But to Misa, that felt very special. And it's something that is so real and grounded. And that's a reason why Tomoya, the way that he is just so realistically annoying. And even the way that, and I think the way that they portrayed it as well, in the Korean version, when, like, yes, the guy was nervous around being around Nisa and the female lead and the best friend, um when the affair initially started, but he was getting bolder and bolder. But for this one, it they kind of like played it in a sense that Tomoya really wanted to make it work, and whenever, because of his apprehensions, like that's when he kind of like goes to Reina, but at the end of the day, like he would still choose Misa over Reina, and that doesn't make him better than the Korean version, obviously, but it kind of like changes the dynamic in terms of those two characters were portrayed or shaped. And again, it's so easy to not like the Korean version because it's such an exaggerated kind of extreme pull of a character. He was literally written so that you hate him. Whereas Tomoya, I feel like, was written just how things are, and that's the reason why you hate him. There's kind of like, this one is deliberately written for you to hate him, and this one is just written so realistically that it's like you get it, you get Nisa's point of view, but you also know enough to hate the character. So yeah, I'm not sure if that entire that entire thing made sense, but yeah. But then again, okay, so moving on from that, just some more final thoughts about these past episodes. Um, I really like that Misa was the one kind of like initiating, um, like when she asked, Wataru to finally kiss her. She was the one who kind of like holds out her hand, and when they were spending like their first New Year together, I really like that in the sense that it it shows her newfound agency when it comes to seeking for happiness in her life. She was already kind of like doubting whether or not she was on the same page with Wataru in terms of, time traveling, if we can even call it that. But yeah. Um, but in a sense, just overall, when it comes to their relationship, it obviously Wataru, while he is forward in terms of wanting to make Misa happy and what he isn't his intentions are in terms of wanting her happiness, he's not as forward with her romantically, and with Misa kind of like taking charge. It's just nice to see in a sense, not because of kind of like, feminism 2025 or anything like that, but it shows a lot in terms of what this entire story was just trying to show. That while Wataru was given a second chance at life, he was still very much hesitant to kind of grasp on things. He was being very careful, still being very careful about his choices because he's doing it for someone else. Versus with Misa, she's doing these things mostly for herself. And that's a good thing because now in this life, she's choosing her happiness. And I really kind of like that dynamic in terms of these two characters, because I hope to see Wataru grasping for his own happiness later on into the story so that they can finally meet in the middle. Because again, if he just actively pushes for Misa's happiness but not his own, then I do think that it would again genuinely affect how they approach this new life together. Um, and I feel like that's something that, given the parallels that are being drawn throughout the story of one person's POV versus another, them being on two sides of those pages, I think it just makes sense that Wataru also has his own kind of like arc of grasping, happiness for himself, which is can be related to Misa, but with me, like now Misa is taking charge of her own happiness and kind of like pursuing it. And I want that for Wataru as well, so that they're on the same page. And it's not just kind of like a protector figure that Wataru is playing, but an equal player in both of their lives. Um, and with that said, the ending of episode 8. So Misa finally confesses that this was her second chance at life. Something happened, blah, blah, blah. She was probably hoping that with all the clues that she's put together, that Wataru was the same. But, and the brilliance of that scene is you can actually see in Wataru's face when he makes the choice, because Misa, like her fate was going not just Reina, but for um for Suzumiya-san. I'm so bad with names. But with Suzumiya-san, and she's become a beloved friend, and like her illness and also like the thing with her husband that ends up being, that fate, and Misa didn't want that for someone that she cared about, and so she was saying that she would just choose to end it herself so that no one would suffer through that similar fate. And then Suzuki Wataru. What is up with me kind of like switching, being so messy with names right now? But with Wataru, you can see the way that it clicks with him, that he has to shift things around. And that was the choice. It was obvious that he didn't mean it. I think that was very clear in terms of the story. It wasn't that he was breaking up with her because he finds her ridiculous. And the way that they portrayed it, even without saying anything, the way that Takeru portrayed that, even without saying anything, kind of like shows or helps the audience read between the lines that it wasn't something that he intended to do. Um, but it was obvious that he was doing it so that Misa's fate would probably change. And again, this is what I'm saying is I hope that Wataru also gets his own arc of, kind of like choosing his happiness and trying to navigate this with Misa rather than navigating it for her. Um, and the way that, he goes to Yuto to talk to him, I think it was mostly to entrust caring for Misa, not necessarily in a romantic sense, but kind of like watching after her as well while he goes. I'm not sure what his thing is gonna be, because he was seen at the airport at the end of episode 8. But I'm just pretty curious. Like, I hope that the next episode would explore him not being that protector figure, but rather kind of like meeting Misa in the same page, finally admitting that he also was given a second chance at life and all these things, and they kind of like navigated through together. I hope that they really weave that into the plot. I think that they will, given how they've written these two characters so far. With Misa, I think it'll be a very trying episode 9 for her of thinking about, in exchange for her happiness, this is what's happening to people around her, and that she's also lost someone who she ended up falling in love with, all these other stuff, because she wasn't meant to like be with someone other than Tomoya in her former life. Yes, so all these other like complicated issues, stuff like that. But so far, again, I really, really like it. I kind of like feel like they should have ended episode 8 in a higher note, though, because episode 6 was brilliant the way that they wrapped that up. And so far, the way that they've been doing like the 2 episode cut-offs with the cliffhangers so far, I feel like episode 8's cliffhanger was delivered the weakest. And that isn't to say that it's bad. It's just more so like going by the trends of episodes 2 and episodes 4 and episode 6. Yeah, it just felt like there was kind of like a weak moment there for how they cut off this particular like cliffhanger. But yeah, I mean, overall, I'm super excited as to how they're gonna wrap this up. Again, I've mentioned all of my hopes for the last 2 episodes. But so far, so good. Shout out to really loving how they're not making Koshiba Fuka's outfits as Misa, even for kind of like the other parts too out of character, except for the Gyaru one, because obviously like that was intentional. And side note, I also recreated that look. It was so fun. But again, and with they're so on point in terms of how they're styling Takeru Sato as Wataru as well. Just some other unrelated notes there. But yeah, so tell me down in the comments below, what are your thoughts of these episodes? If you like my video, then please give this a thumbs up. If you're new to my channel and you would want to hear more from me, please subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon in a new one. Bye!